Clerk, could you state your name and address for the record, please?
He needs to be sworn in. Please raise your right hand. You do solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give in this constitutes the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but yourself, you God?
I do.
Mr. Ivory, can you please state your name for the record?
Harold Ivory Jr.,
And what is your title?
building code official, Cecil Township, building inspector.
Okay. And how long have you worked in that capacity?
Here, 5 years.
And you've been a building inspector for quite some time, correct?
15 years.
Let's see, you were contacted by Mr. O'Maddock to inspect a structure at 349 Grange Road, is that right?
Correct.
Okay. And what did Mr. O'Maddock tell you about the structure?
Well, he had contacted me about putting the structure in, and I know that we only issued it as storage only. But because it was larger than 1,000 square feet, I had to make sure that it was anchored. So he had questions about the anchoring of
You're going to have to speak.
I think this is
Yeah,
how
you
it's
can keep your voice up.
it.
Okay, so I'm sorry, did you say, you understood that the particular mobile home was for an accessory structure,
It was
correct?
for an accessory structure, storage only.
Okay, and that's because you looked at the permit before you went out there to inspect.
Correct. That application that comes through, my signature's on it also, because I review the plans and issue the permits. So,
Okay. But now, when you arrived for the inspection, what did you observe?
there was a manufactured mobile home on the property. It was anchored down. But on my way to the property, I came to it, I went to the wrong place, which was up by his house, excuse me, and I didn't know where it was at. So I called the zoning officer. She told me it was moved. It was moved down above the hill. I even asked her then about moving it, and asked her about, is this the same property, because it has 2 principal structures on it. She explained to me about they couldn't have 2 principal structures on that property.
Okay, so at the time you arrived, your understanding was that this was for a second residence on that property, correct?
No, at the time I arrived, I'm looking at a storage structure
Okay.
to be on his property as a storage structure, not a principal structure.
Okay. But that's not what you observed when you arrived, is that correct?
Correct.
What did you observe when you arrived?
I observed a mobile home that was being put together for someone to live in.
Okay. And was the sewage, on-lot sewage completed at that time or in process?
I don't believe it was completed on my first inspection.
And you knew that the residential occupied structure was inconsistent with the permit that was issued, correct?
Correct.
And in light of that fact, you were unable to issue any kind of permit to Mr. O'Maddock for occupancy, is that right?
I actually told Mr. O'Maddock what I had observed at the inspection and informed him that he probably was going to need to subdivide it because he had 2 principal structures on that property.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Ivory. Unless Mr. Jessic has any questions for you?
I don't have any questions. Anybody have any questions?
Yeah, I have a couple questions for Harold. Harold, did you make any determination as to whether or not Mr. O'Maddock's property was conforming or non-conforming as to his use?
Objection, that calls for a legal conclusion outside the scope of what Mr. Ivory would be doing.
That's my point.
To the extent you know, can you answer the question?
To the extent I know,
Yes.
my information was taken from the zoning officer.
Okay, so you didn't make any of your own conclusions.
Correct.
So all the questions I have for Mr. Ivory.
Nobody in the audience have any questions further? Any questions further?
I'd next like to call Ms. Mowery as it come across.
Can I get an offer of proof?
I'm sorry.
Offer of proof.
Ms. Mowery testified on the first night. She made some statements. There are statements that she made to the zoning officer that I want in the record to demonstrate the inconsistencies for why we were told, the township was told this particular parcel was going to be on the property and what it is actually being utilized for now.
Seems relevant.
Not my objection, but that's all irrelevant.
Noted.
Does she need to be sworn in again? Okay. Ms. Mowery, can you please state your name for the record?
Tricia Mowery.
And you were here on the first night of the hearing, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And you were speaking in a representative capacity of some kind for Mr. Omatic, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. Now, you also spoke with Ms. Ross in advance of filing for the zoning permit for this mobile home, correct?
I spoke more with Gateway engineer Andy Zeroth more than I spoke with Elizabeth Ross. But yes, I vaguely spoke with Elizabeth Ross.
Okay.
And in order to put together this application, I was advised by Dan Dieseroth with Gateway Engineer, who we have worked with, Mr. Ometic and I have worked with for about 6 months through this process.
Okay. You're not stating, as you sit here today, that Mr. Dieseroth told you anything other than you needed to subdivide the property, are you?
Yes, when we first started with the township with Dan Dieseroth, we went down when the citations were issued. And just to kind of go through the process, because I think the steps are getting missed along the
Ms.
way.
Mowery, your attorney can ask you for all the direct questions that you
Okay.
want. I just have some very pointed questions for you.
Yes, the conversations with Dan Dieseroth were more than just subdivision.
Okay, so you're telling us as you sit here today, we could bring in Mr. Dieseroth and he's going to agree with you that he told you there were other options that you could do other than subdividing this property to make it compliant.
Yes, he said to apply for the continuance of the nonconformance to the zoning hearing board.
Okay, that's a direct statement from Mr. Dieseroth.
I
That's what
don't
he told
know.
you?
I don't know if it was direct, but I know in my conversations, I don't know word for word, but in order for us to apply to the zoning board, after citations were issued, we went down that line. I was working with Mr. Dieseroth on the options of the subdivision. He had told me after Ms. Ross, I forget back and forth because all three of us were having the conversation, Dan, Elizabeth, and I. We worked with, Dan had called me back and said, call DEP and see what needs to happen for the subdivision. I did that, called Dan back, told him what DEP said. Dan's like, I can't believe they said that, let me call them. He called them, and then we discussed the options of how the obstacles to do the subdivision, what would be created, which would be DEP informed us at that time there was some grandfathering and he would end up losing, the other people would lose their homes. So Dan Dieseroth had indicated to me, whatever, not word for word, but to apply for this variance to the board because I wouldn't have known not to do that. So conversations with the township is which led us down here.
Okay, so Ms. Mowery, if you could just answer my questions, your attorney can ask you whatever questions he wants to ask you. It sounds to me that most of these conversations you're talking about with Mr. Dieseroth were related to subdividing, correct?
No, not most of the conversations. I've had conversations with Dan Dieseroth over the course of the year, so maybe half of them were relating to subdivision, half of them weren't. I cannot tell you how many conversations were not related to subdivision. Subdivision was a topic that we had discussed.
Do you have anything in writing from Mr. Dieseroth saying that you have a existing non-conforming use and that you should apply for that?
Not in writing.
Okay. And for the record, it's your testimony that he actually advised you and told you that you may have a pre-existing non-conforming use. Is that your testimony?
You know, I don't understand why you're being like so, like, I mean, I don't Dan Roth and I both work in this industry. We were talking to come up with a solution for Mr. O'Malley.
I'm asking Ms. Mowery.
Anything very specific, I think Dan had indicated to me the solution for Mr. O'Malley at this time, not only for Mr. O'Malley, but for all the other people that live up there in those homes, that this was the solution, was to come before this board and ask the variance, or to continue his non-conforming, because those trailers were put there way before the zoning was put in.
Ms. Mowery, my only question then was, is it your testimony today that Mr. Deiseroth told you that you should come here and seek an extension of a non-conforming use?
I don't know if those were his exact
thank
words.
you. Thank you. Now, as we saw in the email that I just gave to you, you did tell Ms. Ross, the Township Zoning Officer, that this particular mobile home was going to be used for storage, correct?
Correct, at that time it was going to.
Okay, and it will be located amongst all his other storage buildings and barn, right? Okay, and that was in 2019.
Correct.
Now, that's not completely accurate and consistent with what you told the zoning hearing board the first night of the hearing, correct?
What do you mean?
Okay, the transcript should be up there.
What do you mean what's not consistent? No, the transcript is not here. I do not have the
Does
transcript.
your attorney have it?
What do you mean wasn't consistent from the email? I mean, I think Mr. O'Malley, when he started out.
For the record, I'm not Ms. Mowery's attorney. I'm Mr. O'Malley's attorney.
Do you have the transcript? And I can just read this to you, Ms. Mowery. On page 10, or on page 5 of the transcript, you were speaking to the board.
What section do you have the transcript in? This isn't the transcript. This is your binder. What page did you say? No, I don't have all of them.
On page 5, you told the board that it was the objective to move Mr. O'Malley's daughter to that home on the R1, correct?
It was the objective now. It wasn't always Mr. O'Malley's objective.
Okay, so it wasn't the objective in 2019. Was it the objective in 2018 when you helped him apply for the 10-acre exemption permit?
Yeah, and actually what the Washington County exemption form was, I went down and met with the Washington County, and at that time the inspector was out sick. There was a fill-in there. So when I sat down there and filled that application, the Washington County sewage exemption out with them, we checked off, yes, it was residential at that time, because whatever structure was going to be there, it had a bathroom, it had a toilet, it was going to have a sink. Like Mr. O'Malley said, he originally was going to be his workshop type thing. So it was with Washington County Sewage Council. I sat down there with the woman that was down there, that was the fill-in, and we filled that application out together. So it was, and yes, in Mr. O'Malley's defense, he asked me, I know a little bit, he knows a little bit. He didn't think this process, nor did I, that he needed to hire professionals. That when I was down in Washington County and they said, is there going to be a toilet in there? Is there going to be a sink? Blah, blah, blah. And I indicated yes. So then we checked, yes, it was a residential structure because it was for residential use.